For today, we'll be discussing the overview on the economic operations in the power system, particularly discussing the history of the Philippine power system. First part of our discussion is on the history of the Philippine power industry. Now, when discussing the history of the Philippine power industry, we have to start with the entity that managed the power business for a long time, and that's the National Power Corporation. In 1936, the hydroelectric industry was nationalized through Commonwealth Act 120, and also in that same period in 1936, the Republic Act 2641 enabled the NPC to be converted into a stock corporation with an initial capitalization of 100 million pesos. In the years going forward in 1961 and 67, capitalization further increased from 250 million to 300 million pesos. Now in 1971, all functions and activities of the National Power Corporation were decentralized, therefore forming many groups under the umbrella of the National Power Corporation. In 1972, the president then promoted the welfare through electrification by setting up island grids. They linked up generation facilities and cooperatives for the distribution of power, set up the transmission line grids and associated generation facilities, and own and operate as an integrated system all generating facilities supplying power of the grid. Eventually in 1974, NPC was assigned under the Office of the President. Now the NPC now manages the whole generation business as well as the transmission business by this time. Capitalization grew to 2 billion pesos with indebtedness of 3 billion pesos. NPC was later attached in 1975 to the Department of Public Works, Transportation and Communication. Just recently, nowadays, these are separate departments of government. In 1976, capitalization grew to 8 billion, but indebtedness grew to 12 billion pesos. With this kind of indebtedness, there was an authorization to contract foreign loans of up to 4 billion US dollars. At the same time, in 1976, NPC tried to enter nuclear power development. Now, as the power industry grew, it was only in 1977 that a new department was created, particularly the Department of Energy as we know now, so that all policies are being coordinated and integrated through this department in terms of power. In 1978, capitalization grew further to 50 billion pesos, and there was a reorganization that was done on 1970. Now, moving forward, NPC then purchased Meralco's assets, particularly its generation, not its distribution, at a total cost of 1.1 billion pesos. Particularly the generation assets that were purchased are the Malaya, Gardner's 1 and 2, Cinders 1 and 2, and some fuel storage facilities. Nowadays, this generation, with the exception of Malaya, are not running anymore. In 1988, electricity rates were pegged to not more than 2 pesos and 50 centavos per kilowatt hour. And the MOA that was signed with NEA is that NPC take over all generating facilities in remote islands. So before it was managed by NEA, but since 1988, it was taken over by NAPOCOR or NPC. April 1991, various electric cooperatives were also taken over by NPC in 26 remote islands. Some milestones as we grow closer to the current day. In 1989, there was an encouragement that the private sector be involved further in major economic activities of the country. And finally, there was an IRRR, or an implementing rule, uh, that established a co-generation, or sometimes it was called build, operate, and transfer, or build, own, operate, of facilities by private uh, between the private sector and the government. The first BOT agreement was signed in 1988. A generation plant or facility in Metro Manila called the Hopewell Energy was built. It's a 2 by 110 megawatt gas turbine plant in Luzon, particularly in Metro Manila. But now this plant has already been mothballed in 1991. Now, this is why it's important to discuss the history of the Philippine power industry. It's because these kinds of experiences that you have just seen, and right now you will be seeing as we go forward, are it's important to remember that these are common experiences across all countries that have started or that have gone through liberalization of the power industry. When I say liberalization, where you technically involve at a higher degree the private sector for more competition. And this is what happened to us, and it similarly happened to most other countries that have gone through the process of establishing an electricity market that is independent. Now, in 1991, we had the power crisis where power supply was very deficient. And at that time, we were very, very dependent on hydroelectric plants. And whenever there's a period where we call it El Nino, where it takes months of a dry season, it seldom rains. Yeah, I think you're familiar with that. And whenever that happens, and hydro plants are their capabilities are derated, and we are very dependent on them, supply obviously goes down, which cannot support the increasing demand in 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 the country, in the Philippines. So if you must know, at that time in the 90s, the Philippines was a growing economy, and when a growing economy comes with growing requirement for electricity demand or electricity. And so what happened was, there were 11 gas turbines that were immediately installed throughout the country, and 768 diesel generator sets were installed in remote islands. So this is a power crisis that was experienced in 91, that required emergency powers, because you had to purchase all these generators that are easy to set up, locate. They're very flexible, but the problem is the fuel and the technology is at the time very expensive. So this is why power rates went up during the 90s. Now, because of that experience in the power crisis in the 90s, then President Fidel Ramos eventually entered into IPPs, because he had no choice but to interact more with with the private sector. Now, the usual or the typical problem that is being experienced again by most countries is that, and this is like an issue whenever there's when the government is taking charge of assets such as generation capacities. The issues there are, obviously, budget wise, you have to have budget approved, reviewed, and that takes a lot of processes altogether. And also, the issue there is if it's not private and it's under the government, sometimes rehabilitation um, is not emphasized further, which is why in 2001, eventually it culminated in 2001. We had the Electric Power Industry Reform Act passed during that time because NPC IPPs already were accounted for 31%. Before it was 100% in the 80s, but in the 90s it was slowly being sold, and then eventually to promote a sense of um, privatization as well as competition in an electricity market. EPIRA, as I've said, or Electric Power Industry Reform Act, was passed in 2001. Now, alongside it, in October 16, 2001, the Malampaya project was inaugurated, giving way to around 1,500 megawatts for the Santa Rita and San Lorenzo natural gas. They're both located in Batangas, whereas a total of 1,200 was set up in Ilijan. So those natural gas that now totals around 2,700, and that capacity is being supplied by the Malampaya natural gas. Eventually, privatization continued on from 2001 until such time that the country was able to launch what we call now as the wholesale electricity spot market in Luzon. That was in June 26, 2006. And the market eventually progressed. Um, in Actually, it's not covered here, but in December 26, 2010, WESM was eventually introduced in Visayas. Currently, Luzon and Visayas are interconnected through an HVDC link, so a market and a wholesale market for electricity is now being commercially operated between Luzon and Visayas. Now the country tried implementing a different market in Mindanao in 2013. It was called the Interim Mindanao Electricity Market. Now, why have a different market in Mindanao? At the time, Mindanao was experiencing deficits in power, and because there was deficits in power, there was a need for capacities to show up, particularly those embedded in the distribution facilities. So those capacities that are there that have no contract with other customers outside of their franchise area was being allowed to sell that capacity if the owner or its contracted customer doesn't need it, so he can actually sell it to another one through this kind of market, a deficit market. However, there were issues that were experienced during this period, and it only ran for more than 2 or almost 3 months, and it was eventually intervened on February 2014, and we haven't had the market for Mindanao since then. And the plan is to have them have a wholesale market. And now that Mindanao has more capacities in their grid and there's no more deficit, actually there's a problem of a surplus now. Um, the plan of the government is to have a wholesale market in Mindanao by 2020, early part of 2020 next year. Now let's discuss what actually transpired in the restructuring of EPIRA since 2001. Now, what are the different objectives of EPIRA? First, it hopes to ensure and accelerate the total electrification of the country, which includes providing electricity to remote areas. Its goal is actually to provide and ensure that electricity is secure, reliable, has an acceptable quality, and is affordable for all areas that it serves. It hopes to ensure that prices of electricity are transparent and reasonable. Private capital's inflow should be enhanced, and that the treatment of public and private sector entities should be fair and non-discriminatory in the process of restructuring the power industry. It hopes to protect public interest, which means, as we've said in the previous slide, um, basic requirement is to have reasonable, affordable prices for the customers, particularly to assure socially and environmentally compatible energy resources and infrastructure, promote utilization of indigenous and new and renewable energy resources, such as we have a lot of them now: solar, wind, run-of-river, those types of new and renewable energy sources. Provide an orderly and transparent privatization of assets of the NPC. Establish a strong and purely independent regulatory body and system. This regulatory body is now called the Energy Regulatory Commission. To encourage the efficient use of energy and other modalities of demand-side management. Now, in the generation sector, the goal of EPIRA is that this area of the industry should be competitive and open. Generation entities are expected to secure certificates of compliance from the ERC, and that certificate of compliance has a checklist that a generator should abide or comply regularly, does not require a national franchise. Prices charged by a generation company for supply of electricity shall not be subject to regulation. Sales shall be value added and tax zero rated, and they are required to submit financial statements. For the transmission sector, EPIRA stated that the transmission sector is a regulated common electricity carrier business. This entity shall operate the transmission asset, and they should be operated by only one company that shall also serve as the grid operator and the metering service provider for all grid-connected generation and customers or distribution utilities. The distribution sector also is a regulated common carrier business, but downstream from the transmission, we have a lot of distribution utilities or electric cooperatives that provide distribution services and connections to its system. It should be able to provide open and non-discriminatory access. It has an obligation to supply electricity in the least cost manner, and it should also prepare and submit an annual distribution development plan. The supply sector, on the other hand, shall be open and competitive, where suppliers are required to have a license from the regulator, and in this case, it's the Energy Regulatory Commission. Now, what are the other features of EPIRA? Government assumes that a portion of the financial obligations of NPC not exceeding 200 billion pesos. Full recovery of stranded debt and stranded costs are actually managed 15 to 25 years. Universal charge are fixed and approved by the ERC. This universal charge includes payment of those stranded debts, missionary electrification, equalization of taxes and royalties, and watershed rehabilitation and management. So that cost that is added to electricity rates here in the Philippines, that covers that payment of stranded debts, missionary electrification, equalization of taxes and royalties, and for purposes of watershed rehabilitation and management are included as universal charge. The Energy Regulatory Commission was created through EPIRA, which promotes competition, it encourages market development. Since you have an open market for customers to buy generation from different entities, you're ensuring more that they have a choice in terms of supply. And eventually, the Energy Regulatory Commission has a role in penalizing entities that abuse market power. NPC assets have been privatized largely for Luzon and Visayas. Okay, so there's still some assets being owned by NPC in Mindanao, but mostly they are now being privatized in view of having an open market. Now, for areas that are located outside the Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao grids, we call those generation small power utility generation or SPUG. They are still managed by NPC for those islands that are not connected to the main grid of the Philippines. PISALM, or Power Sector Assets and Liabilities Management Corporation, was created through EPIRA. Through them, they are managing all assets as far as privatization and also eventually the liabilities that were incurred by the government prior to EPIRA. Electric cooperatives were now converted to either a stock cooperative or stock corporation. That condonation of electric cooperatives was also established in EPIRA. IPP contracts were largely reviewed. Power purchase and energy conversion agreements between government entities were renegotiated. And obviously, cross subsidies were removed. So, what do we mean by cross subsidy? Before, there was only one common price for electricity. But now you have different prices of electricity across areas in the country. So, a price way north of Luzon is largely different from the prices way south of Luzon. So as said, one of the milestone of EPIRA is it was able to create ERC, or the Energy Regulatory Commission. It also created what we call now the Bible for grid utility or grid utilities and distribution utilities. We call them the grid code for technical requirements and specifications in the grid. And for the distribution sector, they follow what we call the distribution code. As was said, TRANSCO and PISALM was created through EPIRA. Rates were unbundled so that you have more of an idea what is part of your rates, what is part generation charge, what's part distribution charge, how much is transmission charge, how much is universal charge. There's also a way now with EPIRA to how you best administer universal charges as mentioned before. Intra-regional grid cross subsidy is also removed, so a price in Luzon is very, very different from the prices in Visayas. Inter-class cross subsidy is also partially complied. Open access and transmission system rules were also established through EPIRA. Sub-transmission assets were now privatized. Again, an electricity market, a spot market, was also established through EPIRA. And NPC assets were now privatized through EPIRA. Now that ends the first part of the overview for this lecture.